Okay. We will open the meeting tonight, 6 o'clock. I'd like to invite you to stand and say the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, Ben, Liana, we will turn it over to you for our training this evening.
Evening's training is provided on behalf of Association Washington Cities. It's a video community planning and development for elected officials. It's right up your alley. Liana, can you confirm you're seeing the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen. Did you see the checkbox that I was talking about when you went to
Yeah.
share screen? Okay, perfect.
And so video or audio should start too.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Tanya Sugarman, AWC Member Services Director. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you don't see the attendee control panel, you can click the orange arrow button in the upper right corner of your screen to reveal it. Audio plays through your computer speakers by default. If you would prefer to listen on your phone, select phone call in the control panel's audio pane and follow the dial-in instructions. You can submit questions or comments at any time via the control panel's questions pane. We will collect all questions and address as many as we can at the end of the presentation.
Hi, Christy.
Should you experience technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar phone support at the number you see here. Finally, please note that we are recording today's presentation and will email a link to the webinar recording to all registered attendees within 1 week. This webinar series is a partnership between MRSC and Association of Washington Cities. The Municipal Research Services Center provides research and consulting services for Washington's local governments and state agencies, and the Association of Washington Cities has a mission to serve our members through advocacy, education, and services. The Elected Officials Essential webinar series, Community Planning and Development 101, is the third webinar in a 4-part series. So thank you for joining us. We have 2 great presenters on the webinar today. Steve Butler has been a professional planner for over 30 years. He currently works as the Planning and Policy Manager for MRSC, where he conducts research and provides planning advice to cities, towns, and counties throughout Washington. He has been involved in most aspects of community planning, both in the public and private sectors in the states of Washington, Oregon, Maine, and Wisconsin. Leonard Bauer is the City of Olympia's Deputy Director for Community Planning and Development. He manages all aspects of planning and community development for the city. Leonard was the Managing Director of Growth Management Services at the Washington State Department of Commerce for 12 years. Prior to that, he spent 14 years as a planner and planning director at various local governments. Both Steve and Leonard have been inducted into the Fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, a national recognition for excellence in the field of planning. We are lucky to have both planners joining us today, and now I'll turn it over to Steve to get us started.
Thanks, Tanya. Welcome, everybody. So on this slide is what we're going to be covering today during the webinar. And you can see on there, it's a combination of talking a little bit about what is community planning, its importance, talk about planning related state laws. We're going to be focusing a fair amount on comprehensive planning, both planning itself as well as their implementation, talking about implementation of land use regulations, and then finally, who is and should be involved in your local processes. And we want to leave some time at the end to answer any questions you may have today. So before I go and we go into the deep dive into the meat and potatoes of our presentation, Leonard and I want to just take a moment to give a shout out to the short course on local planning program. It's administered by the Washington Department of Commerce and co-sponsored by a number of organizations. It's a program that provides 3-hour sessions throughout the state on local planning issues. And it's going to go into a lot more detail and cover more materials than we're going to be able to cover in today's 1-hour webinar. So just want to make sure that you're aware of that program. And also, we wanted to give the shout out because Leonard and I relied heavily on a lot of the materials they have for the content of today's webinar. So thank you. So why is planning important? Now you're talking to two biased presenters for both professional planners, but I think what we want to impart to you is that basically community planning in its essence is the process of developing a broad vision and then more specific objectives about what you want your community to look and feel like 5, 10, and 20 years down the road, and then creating an action plan for how to actually get there. So planning can help you protect and enhance the things you like and cherish about your community, can help you identify your community's visions and needs. It can also help you identify local spending priorities. Money is always an issue. There's never enough, so it's helpful to prioritize how to spend those precious local resources. And then hopefully your planning process will build a strong sense of community in your city, and then enhance as well regional coordination and cooperation. In addition, the rapid growth that has been recently experienced in some parts of our state have also reinforced the importance and need for good community planning. So or to put it simply in the words of that famed philosopher, Yogi Berra, you've got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. Now, to address Yogi's concern, your local comprehensive plan should be your community's roadmap for you and to decide how you get there. So what I'd like to do now is to ask a quick poll question to get a sense of who's on the audience right now, who's listening in the webinar. Okay, so it turns out that we have a technical glitch on that poll, so we're going to skip over that one, but there'll be a couple others, so stay tuned for that. What I'd like to do now then is to turn it over to Leonard, who will talk about Washington's major land use laws.
Thanks, Steve. So in Washington, we have several types of land use laws. These are a few of the major ones that guide all cities in their planning. The State Environmental Policy Act and the Shoreline Management Act were both adopted back in 1971, and really came from the people. They were both activated after referendums that had moved them forward at that time. The State Environmental Policy Act requires review of potential environmental impacts of all actions, including your land use actions. Granting permits is a land use action that's governed under the SEPA. The Shoreline Management Act, as it sounds like, governs development on the shoreline, so near waters of the state, which include Puget Sound, major lakes, rivers, and some streams over a certain size. So there's a special overlay there. Then in 1990, the Growth Management Act was passed, and this has become now the comprehensive planning framework for cities in the state. There are different sets of recommendations for the larger and more populous counties and cities, but it does have requirements for all cities. For those that don't have the full set of recommendation or requirements under growth management, the Planning Enabling Act is still in place, which has been in place for decades, and that is something that the smaller cities and counties need to pay attention to. And all cities and counties also must follow the Local Project Review Act. In 1995, that was adopted to address the process of land use decision making. We'll talk a lot more about that later. And finally, the Platting and Subdivision Law, which again has been in place for many years, that regulates the division of land into different lots. And so that too involves land use actions that the city must take to approve those. And so this guides that process. So you can see there's quite a web of regulations that you need to be aware of. We will focus primarily now on the Growth Management Act. That is the major sort of framework under which all of these pieces work. The Growth Management Act starts with goals. These are statewide goals, and cities are directed to work towards all of these goals. Obviously, that's a difficult balance, and you have challenges in terms of how you focus locally on that, but all cities must be looking at these and trying to move all of these forward. I've heard an analogy that this is much like pushing 13 different balls up a mountain, but you must do that. You must at least try to do that, but there's a lot of flexibility for local focus and how you balance that. So speaking of the actions that all cities and counties must look at, this is starting for counties. They must designate and conserve natural resource lands. This is all 39 counties in the state must designate the commercially significant agricultural lands, forest lands, and mineral resource lands. While this direction doesn't affect cities specifically, it does have effect. And so you should be aware and working with your counties on where these lands are, how they contribute to the local economy, and what that means for your city's comprehensive plan. All cities and counties must designate and protect critical areas using the best available science. There's 5 types of critical areas listed here, and your city must designate these either through a mapping exercise, or more commonly, it's done through a definitional exercise where criteria is established in your codes to determine when and where those critical areas might be present. Then as new development comes forward, typically cities will ask those developers to use that criteria, hire a specialist in that area to show where or if those types of critical areas are present on that site. As I mentioned earlier, some counties and the cities within them must do a full set of requirements under the Growth Management Act, including adopting a comprehensive plan that's consistent with that act. So those counties shown in blue here and the cities within them are the ones that are required to do that full set of comprehensive planning. The counties in the purple and the cities within them still must do the land use conservation areas designation and the critical areas designation and work towards those goals that we talked about. But the comprehensive planning aspects of the Growth Management Act are not required for those cities. It doesn't mean you can't do a comprehensive plan, and it's certainly recommended that you do for the reasons Steve mentioned earlier, but it doesn't have to follow the exact requirements of the Growth Management Act. So another quick poll, and it looks like this hopefully will work this time. We'd like to ask how much do you think community planning is currently valued in your community? Very valued, somewhat valued, somewhat unvalued, not valued at all, or do you not know or unsure? Please click on one of these for your community and submit, and we'll see what those results are. Okay, do we have all the results in?
Interesting.
Looks like it's quite a mix, that there's a number of jurisdictions that value or very value, but there's also a number that don't value planning at all. Hopefully, as we move forward here and talk about the framework for comprehensive planning, you can learn of ways to help communicate that value to your community. So the beginning of the comprehensive planning process under the Growth Management Act is the countywide planning policies, or in the case of the Central Puget Sound area, there are multi-county planning policies, which 4 counties involved in the Puget Sound Regional Council adopt together. These planning policies provide that regional framework under which cities adopt their local comprehensive plans. And that regional framework addresses things like urban growth areas, where your cities can expand into over time, how we're going to accommodate population growth within the region, how we cite these public facilities that are of a countywide or statewide nature that are typically very difficult to cite, affordable housing, a very, very big topic these days in many parts of the state, as well as economic development, which also is a very big topic. So these are regional issues. In addition to these, there's another major regional issue, of course, is transportation. And you should have a regional transportation plan in many parts of the state as well that's accomplished through your local council of government or regional transportation planning organization. Once those countywide planning policies are adopted and in place, and they have been in all parts of the state for many years now, that becomes the guide for your local comprehensive plan. And this pyramid sort of really illustrates how you proceed from working with your community at a broad level to establish an overall vision for where that community is headed, what you'd like to accomplish in the next 20 years, then forming this plan that includes the goals and policies that the city will follow to accomplish that, and the implementation strategies to carry out those goals and policies. We'll talk about each of these steps in more detail as we move forward. I'd like to begin with that comprehensive plan. If you have a community vision, you've done some public visioning exercises or input from your community and have an overall vision of what you'd like the community to look like in 20 years, how the new development and new population will be handled, then you can work on this comprehensive plan. And under the Growth Management Act, these are the major elements or chapters that plan must address at a minimum. Land use, of course, how new development occurs, what happens on the land, transportation, housing, utilities, both public and private. So there are challenges in working with private utility providers sometimes in terms of getting information and working that out, but that is required to attempt to do that as best as you can. Capital facilities, which is your city's construction plan, essentially, what types of facilities you're building. And then for counties, there's a separate rural element, which I'll talk a little bit more about later because it also has effects on cities and towns. You have the option of adding other elements to your comprehensive plan. And here's some examples from cities around the state that have been adopted. These or any other important topic to your community may become an element or a chapter of your plan if it's important to the community vision. So please think broadly in terms of what's important to the community and then how you can address that in the plan. There are also external inputs into the plans. In addition to the multi-county or countywide planning policies, counties must adopt an urban growth area boundary for all urban areas in that county. And that's based on a land capacity analysis, which is often called buildable lands report. There's some other aspects of the Growth Management Act which require this analysis. The cities participate and have input into the county's process on that. I also want to note the Department of Commerce is currently updating its guidance on how to conduct a buildable lands report based on some new legislation that was passed in the state legislature last year. So important to get up to speed on that process. That, as I said, is still in process, but I believe Commerce expects to release that by about the end of 2018. There's also other adopted plans or studies or regulations of other jurisdictions you'll want to pay attention to, such as that regional transportation plan, state and federal regulations that may apply, or your neighbors, other cities and counties' local plans or special districts plans. Those all have impacts on your community and should be consulted for consistency and how you can collaborate and work together. But most important is the public input. If you've conducted a good public input process, hopefully you have an informed consent. In other words, you're not trying to get unanimity around your community. That's probably not possible. There will be many, many opinions on many of the aspects of your plan, but sharing the information, helping guide that discussion can lead to people being informed and at least understanding why we're moving forward in a certain direction and gain general support in your community for that. There's requirements in the Growth Management Act for consistency internally within the plan and consistent within the regional context. So these are some questions, especially these first couple of bullets, that you should be asking yourself constantly throughout both the planning process and as you're implementing your plan. Is everything you have in that plan physically possible to do together? Are you calling for different things in certain parts of the community that are conflicting? Then your plan is not internally consistent and you have to really look at those different pieces and make sure that they can work together. Do they all tell the same story as getting to that vision? And can adequate public facilities be provided with the development that's planned? This is sometimes called concurrency in the Growth Management Act literature and is an extremely important aspect of the law that you must be able to plan for those adequate facilities. As I mentioned, rural areas are required to be planned for by counties. And under the GMA, rural basically means everything that's not in an urban growth area or not designated as a commercially significant farm or forest land. And the county, though, has flexibility of defining what is the rural character in that county, what are the densities of development that are allowed, define rural services within the limitations of the Growth Management Act. It's typically water on wells, septic systems. And there's a number of other tools that rural areas can use to look at how to look at future development in those areas, because they do develop and change over time. And how that county plans for that rural area is very important to the cities and towns in the region. There are interactions, obviously, economically, transportation, many other aspects. So it's important to have input into the county's rural element and understand it and what those effects might be on your city. The Growth Management Act requires you to update your comprehensive plan every 8 years. There's a schedule in the act that lays out when that's due. But cities can update more frequently than that as needed. These are some things, some reasons you might think about for updating it more frequently. It can't be more frequent than once per year, however. The act does require that within a given year, any amendments be gathered together and considered all at once, so that the consistency can be maintained and you can analyze whether they remain consistent with each other and with the rest of the plan. But if you have some of these changes occurring in your community, you may consider an annual or perhaps biannual update process. Things like changes in demographics or state laws, major infrastructure, capital facilities progress. Also, in some new issues have been emerging. Many communities are looking at climate change impacts. For example, here in the city of Olympia, we are looking at sea level rise, which is a major issue for our downtown, which is right on the shoreline. And there are many other things that are occurring, trends that change really constantly, as we all know. And how do you address those locally? So I'd like to turn back over to Steve to talk about how you can implement that plan once you have it in place.
Thanks, Leonard. So once you've adopted your comprehensive plan, you may think the heavy lifting is done, then now you can take a break. But if you think that, you really would be wrong. Preparing your plan is a very important step, but the rubber meets the road when you really start to focus on implementing your plan and how to go about doing that. So the ways you could consider implementing your plan fall into one of the three categories shown on this slide: regulations, public expenditures, and the third category is other programs, partnerships, and education. And I'm going to describe three now. So the first one is plan implementation through regulation and development projects. Now, the primary influence on how you implement things such as your land use plan, housing plan, and the like is kind of going to be that your community needs to rely heavily on the private sector. Sort of startling for some elected officials to realize that, but a vast majority of development investment in your community will be made by private development. And in some communities, the private development side is also going to be the primary source of investment in public infrastructure as well, that public infrastructure that's related to new development. So as you're doing your plan and then implementing it, it's important that you establish partnerships to make sure that implementing the plans that you end up attracting the type of development that would achieve your community vision, goals, and policies. But the regulatory side of it also means that you need to make sure that new development also meets your community's vision and goals. So this is a list of the major types of development regulations that you could be considering to use, and including zoning, subdivision regulations, street and utility standards. Leonard talked about critical areas ordinance and shoreline regulations. And there's a list of other types of regulations, development standards, sign codes, landscaping, things of that nature. Now zoning, perhaps the most powerful tool to help you implement the comprehensive plan. Zoning is going to affect every property in your community. If you do have a zoning ordinance, and most communities in Washington state do. So it's going to determine and affect things such as where uses are allowed, the kind of the which, where, when, how of kind of what's going to be happening in your community. Zoning regulations are also going to be dealing with building bulk, height, and size, minimum lot sizes, things such as lot coverage, minimums and maximums, residential densities, signage, parking in terms of parking of vehicles and other vehicles, landscaping, fencing, and the list goes on and on. But in addition to zoning, there's also something that a lot of communities are starting to consider. Not required under GMA, but again, and that's what I'm referring to are basically design guidelines and standards. And often, the difference between what is perceived as being good development and bad, incompatible development in your community can be addressed with design standards. And these design standards really focus on the appearance of new construction, and that's both in terms of buildings as well as the overall development site. So the reason why you would want to consider having a set of development standards would be from the building side, you may care about where the building, or how the building looks, but also things such as where is the entrance located? How is the facade modulated? Is there a treatment of windows to make the building more compatible or less compatible with the surrounding neighborhood? Rooftop design, things of that nature. Oftentimes, you'll see prohibitions against blank walls in key areas. For example, in areas where you want to be encouraging a lot of pedestrian activity, such as in the downtown, you probably don't want to allow blank walls. Instead, you'd want to encourage or require commercial style windows and outdoor seating, things of that nature. Now, on the outdoor seating example or items I just mentioned, this is why your design standards often are going to go beyond just the building side and deal with site conditions. Things addressing things such as where are plazas, gathering places located. In addition, design standards will often deal with the design of streetscapes, including sidewalks and other areas, at least in key parts of your community where you really want to focus on the pedestrian side. So, long and short, more and more cities are placing an emphasis on what us planners would call placemaking, which translates into creating places for people through architecture, public space, public amenities, and the like. Now, in addition to zoning and design standards, there's something that's often overlooked when people talk about significant development standards at the local level, and that is public works standards. And these are basically standards for facilities owned by the public, streets, driveways, stormwater retention, and the like. As you all know, the dimensions and design of your streets play a large role in how your community looks and functions. How wide the streets are, you require street trees, width of sidewalks, having street lights or not, are all important. One thing to just be aware of is the fire departments often have a large say in how wide your local streets are going to be, but it's important to kind of acknowledge that there's a balance there between what is needed to provide adequate access by emergency responders, of course, but also having streets that are still going to be friendly to pedestrians. So that's sort of the decision that you would need to have city by city. In terms of stormwater retention and treatment standards, a lot of communities are increasingly encouraging sustainable practices, such as using bioswales versus just putting stormwater into a detention pond or an underground detention vault. Now, the second category of plan implementation is through public capital projects and budgeting as part of your operating and maintenance side of things. Now, while the first category, in terms of regulations, deal primarily with what the private sector can do and cannot do to implement your comprehensive plan, the second category focuses primarily on how cities, towns, and counties budget and use their public funds for primarily public projects. So public expenditures, your comprehensive plan should have a detailed capital facilities element or chapter, which identifies the major big ticket items on the capital side that are needed to implement your plan over the next number of years. These are things such as streets, major utility line expansions, public buildings, major equipment purchases, things of that nature. And the capital facilities element should be the basis for the capital side of your local budget. This element should include an inventory of all your existing facilities, should establish levels of service for those facilities, project the future needs, then identify what gaps exist, when do they need to be filled, how much they're going to cost, and how you're going to pay for them. Now, this may sound easy or not, but it usually takes a lot of work to collect the needed information and then make a series of decisions about the level of service and what you're going to be able to afford and when you can afford them. One thing I want to point out is that when you're doing your capital facilities planning, don't forget to take into account the operating and maintenance side of things, the O&M costs. I mean, for example, if you want to build a new pool, you want to make sure you can afford to actually pay for the necessary maintenance costs that are going to be happening on a regular basis.
Just twist it a little bit. Thanks.
Third category in terms of plan implementation is through a series of things that don't deal with public expenditures, don't deal with regulations, but it's just things such as volunteer programs, partnerships, and education. There's a lot of groups out there that can be very useful and helpful and want to help implement your comprehensive plan, so you should take advantage of them. And on the education and communication side, it's really important that you keep people informed and educated about the importance of what you're trying to do as you implement your comprehensive plan. So here's a list of some tips regarding successful implementation that Leonard and I came up with, and they basically kind of come on the regulatory side, regulations that are clear and flexible. Of course, they need to reflect goals of your plan. You want to have incentives to encourage the type of development and vision in your plan. If you're trying to encourage something, doesn't make sense to make it extra difficult for someone, private sector, public sector, to provide it in your community, right? You want to have a forward-thinking capital budgeting process and document. Leadership is going to be important at all levels, including at the council level. Mentioned about the community involvement earlier, and then it's important to track and measure the results as you go along to make sure that you're actually achieving what your comprehensive plan has said that you want to do. All right, it's time for another quick poll question. And so this is, how controversial have land use issues been in your community over the past 5 years? So it's first one would be very controversial, controversial, somewhat uncontroversial, not controversial at all, or other, don't know, not sure. So if you could submit your responses now, that would be great.
Delray Avenue.
I think they called in when they were running, they mentioned it for us. Hey, we're not the only ones.
All right, that's interesting. This is Leonard again, and we have very or somewhat very controversial communities where land use is very controversial, and some where it's somewhat uncontroversial. So an interesting mix, and some of you don't know or aren't aware yet. So I imagine you will be very soon if you are not yet. Land use does tend to be one of the more controversial issues in many communities, at least. And so I would put to you that this next and last part of the presentation today may be the most important to you as elected officials, because we want to talk about the land use planning decision-making process, what kinds of decisions are involved, who makes them, what the appeals process might look like. And I would note that many times controversy erupts over the process as much as or more than the actual project that's being considered. And so this is a really important part to understand. There's really three types of land use decisions that local governments make. And this is primarily guided by the Local Project Review Act, which I mentioned near the beginning of the presentation. In the Revised Code of Washington, RCW 3670B, as in boy, that was adopted in 1995. There's very detailed legal requirements for land use processes. But the main thing to remember is these three types. The first is legislative, which is essentially the long-range planning, and the two top sections of this pyramid: adopting your plan or revising your plan, and then adopting or revising the regulations that implement that plan. These are the purview for elected officials. You are the rule makers or the rule adopters. And typically these will come to you from your planning commission, who makes a recommendation, and then the city council or commission would adopt those rules and make that final decision. So that is one level of the decision-making process. And there's one process, legislative processes, that involves a lot of public input. You want to encourage that and get that as early and as often as you can throughout that process. The other two types of decisions, quasi-judicial, or in other words, acting as a judge, and administrative, which is the delegation of decision-making to your staff. These are both involved in the third or bottom part of this pyramid: review of private development proposals or infrastructure installation. And basically, that's the act of applying the rules that you've adopted. So the elected officials adopt the rules, staff, and in some cases, a hearing examiner or other type of quasi-judicial decision maker is applying those rules in some cases as well. So these are the three types, and the quasi-judicial administrative processes have a very different process and very different rules around that process than the legislative. I'll go into each of these in much more detail over the next few minutes. In the legislative process, typically a amendment to a plan or a regulation that governs development would be proposed either by council members, by citizens, or by the Planning Commission. If the council directs that those be reviewed, or it's chosen to be reviewed, then typically it would involve a professional review by staff, or in some cases a planning consultant that you may hire as a city. That review includes public involvement, and it would certainly encourage this. As I mentioned earlier, this is aimed at that informed consent, informing people, getting their input, trying to help everyone understand the reasoning maybe behind it, making revisions to it based on the input you get, and having your planning commission make a recommendation based on all that input and all the research they've done back to you as elected officials for final review and adoption. You can include additional public review as part of your review, and that review can involve changes perhaps to the Planning Commission's recommendation, depending on what kind of information you hear. Decisions under the legislative process may be appealed to a growth management hearings board that's established in the Growth Management Act. There are 3 boards, regional boards in the state, and it's 1 board, but 3 panels of that board that, based on regions of the state. And that's where appeals of legislative decisions go. The hearings board would review those based on consistency with the Growth Management Act and the state laws. The quasi-judicial process is quite different. In this case, applying the laws that have been adopted, and basically the decision-making criteria has to do with is the action, whether it's a private development that's proposed or an infrastructure project, is that action consistent with the adopted regulations and criteria that are in place at the time that application is received for that development? Who makes the decision? That is decided on by the elected officials. You may choose to hire a hearing examiner, which is a professional land use expert, typically a land use attorney, who is an independent person and hears those cases that come before him or her, usually in front of a public hearing. It's a very formal type public hearing in this case. It's not the typical one that you hold for a legislative process. This is a fact-finding hearing, and it's conducted much like a court would conduct a hearing, with testimony, exhibits, information provided, and then the examiner, or in some cases that decision maker can be the Planning Commission or the City Council. But that hearing body or hearing examiner must base that decision only on the facts presented and the evidence presented, and only based on is it consistent with the criteria that adopted in the city code and the city plan.
Go ahead.
Even though we all made this to not annex the property up there, is this what they're talking about in that case, something like that? Or is this a whole thing that we've not done?
This is a whole different deal where you have people that bring in. I did this with drug seizures,
Okay.
where I was a hearings officer,
Mhm.
and you hear testimony on both sides. And then you make a decision based on the evidence.
Right, what I'm saying is though, have we run into,
Liana, or Christy, can you hear this, or do I need to stop sharing in order for you to hear this mic too?
No, we can hear.
I can hear.
okay, I'm just curious, is this, because if this is something different than what we do normally, then I don't know that this has happened in the year that I've
It
been
hasn't,
here.
it hasn't yet.
Okay,
So quasi judicial is acting like a judge.
do I get to wear, like,
If you
The
want to
wig.
wear, if you want to
The
wear a
wig.
white wig, you go for it, buddy.
I mean, I'm gonna fur it, I'm not against it, I'm
So-
for it.
The ones that will come to the city council are property specific zone changes,
Okay,
the completion of those, subdivisions, and the
Mhm.
completions of those. Planning Commission handles most of those for you, conditional use proposals, preliminary subdivisions, the shoreline actions now. Board of Adjustment handles variance requests for you. You have the option to use a hearing examiner, and we have a contract in place, or
we could,
a hearing
Yeah.
examiner that we go to for things. We typically, as staff, will advise that when it is somebody comes in with legal representation.
This is just a step I've never seen
Yeah.
or heard us
Yeah.
use. So I was just like,
And hopefully we won't.
this sounds, well, I'm hoping we don't. It doesn't sound like a fun process. It's just one that I was unfamiliar with, so.
It's not that it's not fun. It's fine. It's, you're constrained. It's totally different from city council.
Okay.
With city council, when you're adopting regulations, when you're considering how to budget for things, it's all, what you think is best for that, right? In your individual role in city council. For quasi judicial stuff, there's checklists of things that need to happen with this proposal, and you're reviewing it to make sure it doesn't happen, conditioning things to make sure that it does happen, that sort. So it's.
And it's
just-
very finite.
He was saying it's very strict and very like,
Very
this
fine, yeah.
is, only this gets to be talked
It's
about,
not,
whatever.
it's not just grabbing, oh, I really wish that we had a public park in that subdivision. It's,
Right.
Does the,
Does it meet all these exact
Criteria,
things?
yeah.
Okay, all right, I just didn't.
Well,
wasn't familiar, so.
I wanted to make one more point with quasi judicial hearings is that you also, typically when you're developing policy and regulations and everything, you're reaching out to people and getting input. In a quasi judicial matter, you can't, like, you can't talk to the parties involved. You can only rely on the information that you're provided. And there's a series of questions that legal counsel typically goes through prior to hearing the matter, just to make sure that there were no ex parte communications. And if there were, if you disclose that, then people can decide whether or not you can decide whether or not you need to recuse yourself because of those. But it is pretty much a little bit more, it's just different than your
Okay.
typical processes.
You got any prior knowledge you have of whatever you have come before you? That
Right.
all has to be disclosed and yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Plan. The administrative decision process is a little different and sometimes intersects with that quasi-judicial decision-making process. Administrative decisions are those that the city's code, as adopted by the council, delegates to staff. You have professional staff in most cases, or consultants in some, that can review and meet with applicants, help them before the application with a pre-application meeting, going over what rules or regulations might apply to their proposal for their property, help them in completing their application, getting all the information turned in. And when that is at the date, as I mentioned earlier, the date that's submitted, they are vested, or in other words, it's judged on the rules in place that have been adopted as of that date that that application's been received. That then goes through a review by the staff, again, or a consultant if that's how the city likes to approach it. And typically that will include some opportunity for public comment. The comment, again, should be focused on, does this project or proposal meet the criteria that's been adopted in the code? Would certainly encourage public comment opportunities as early as possible, primarily for two reasons. One, it can help minimize misinformation about the project, the rumor mill that might occur in the community about what's been applied for or what the idea might be behind a certain development or certain piece of property. If that information is out early and put out in an official capacity of what's actually been applied for, that can help cut off those rumors. And secondly, opportunity for public comment can then provide for surfacing issues that might be seen by members of the public. Sometimes there's information that members of the public have that is not immediately available to staff, or they may not be aware of, especially historical information. Sometimes the public is very good at that and has some information. And if that's surfaced early on, then it can be addressed in adjustments to that project proposal before it gets to a full public hearing and decision-making process. Once that review is completed and the staff has been able to compare that to the regulations that apply, they can make a recommendation to the decision maker. If it's an administrative decision, that decision maker is typically on the staff. It's a department director, for example. If that particular type of decision is required to go to a quasi-judicial hearing examiner or quasi-judicial decision-making process, then that staff recommendation is referred to that person who's making that quasi-judicial decision. Under the Project Review Act, only one open record hearing or hearing at which you take testimony is allowed per project. You cannot have multiple hearings, even if there might be multiple different types of permits required. They must be combined into one hearing. There are timelines for decision, and if it is appealed, appeals of this type of decision, either administrative or quasi-judicial decision, go under a different portion of the state law, the Land Use Petition Act. They do not go to the Growth Management Hearings Board, but instead go to typically your local Superior Court. I would like to point out here that that quasi-judicial decision making is really an important process, and how that decision is made and written is very important. And this is why it's an advantage to having a hearing examiner who's been trained to write a clear written decision with findings of fact and conclusions of law. That then can really help the local jurisdiction upon appeal. If it does go to court for an appeal under the Land Use Petition Act, having a clear written decision that lays out the logic behind that decision is a real advantage to the city's case in that situation. For you as elected officials, it's very, very important to understand in your code which decisions you have delegated to a quasi-judicial decision maker, or which of those quasi-judicial decisions may come to the city council. Because the rules are so different between a legislative process, which you're probably most used to, in which you do talk to people around the community, you want to get the information from them, their input, you're free to do that, and you're encouraging people to do that. In a quasi-judicial process, if it is coming to the council for decision, or could possibly come to the council upon appeal, you are serving basically as a judge, and you are not to have outside conversations, which are sometimes called ex parte contacts. That's the legal term for that. But if you have had contacts like that might influence your decision, you have violated that quasi-judicial process. So please be aware early on what types of decisions or which kinds of projects might come to you for a quasi-judicial decision, so you can avoid those contacts politely, of course, as people approach you in the community, and letting them know, hey, I have to act as a judge here, so I can't have preconceived notions. I have to look at the facts of the case in that kind of a situation. So your legal counsel or your planning staff can help you look through your code and learn which of those kinds of decisions might come to you in a quasi-judicial capacity. So who's involved in the planning process? This may seem like a lot, and it is a lot. There's a lot of people involved in most decisions, particularly legislative decisions. And this is just a partial list, really. And there's a lot of interest when you start talking about property and how it can be used, and people's neighborhoods and what might happen in their neighborhoods. It becomes very controversial very quickly often. And so each has a role. And I hope this has been helpful to you in terms of the city's role in that. If you do need help, well, we don't have Lucy available to you. AWC and MRSC and the State Department of Commerce all have assistance and can provide assistance, as well as your own staff and legal counsel. I would encourage you, if you ever have questions, to check in with one of those folks to get some guidance, because it is complicated and a lot of factors are in play. And if controversies do come up, remember, it's never too late or early to plan. As Yogi said, the game isn't over till it's over. If you do have something you're looking at, you go back to your comprehensive plan for guidance and it just doesn't seem to match anymore what that community vision is, you may want to go back and reestablish that roadmap so that you know where you're going and that you can figure out how to get there. With that, thank you, and we will open for questions. I'll turn this back over to Tanya to help facilitate that process.
All right, thank you, Leonard. So yes, that does end the formal part of our webinar presentation, and we do have a few minutes for some questions, and so go ahead and submit those now. And I do have a couple for you as we wrap up today. So my first question to you, Leonard, I have one around the Planning Commission. So the Planning Commission reviews proposed codes and revisions and passes on their recommendation for or against to the City Council. Is the City Council allowed to propose a code or revision without the knowledge of the Planning Commission? And secondary, is this an ethics concern? What do you think, Leonard?
Well, generally,
Circumvent the process.
the state laws I referred to earlier do require a planning commission recommendation on land use issues. There are provisions for emergencies that if they qualify, if the situation qualifies for that, again, check with your legal counsel on that. But if that does apply, that recommendation can be bypassed at least initially for an interim ordinance to be adopted, for example. However, once you do receive a recommendation from the Planning Commission, you as elected officials can certainly consider modifications or revisions to that, especially if you have some additional public process or new information that comes forward. So I would certainly say in most cases you would go to the Planning Commission for the recommendation, but then the elected officials can consider that. Certainly if you're making major changes after the Planning Commission, it would be wise to make sure to check with your staff or legal counsel on whether additional review, for example, under the Environmental Policy Act or an additional public hearing might be necessary. But it is within the elected officials' purview to make changes as you see fit after you've gotten that recommendation.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah, in the Stevenson Municipal Code, and I think the state statutes, it requires you refer to and report from the Planning Commission for zoning changes. So it really depends on your relationship to the Planning Commission or the relationship you want to establish. In the way that Stevenson has typically done things, it's been, here's a topic, we understand that there's need for somebody to explore the options to address this. Planning Commission please do that for us. You could proceed to say, we're going to do this. We're going to come up with what we think is
Circumvent the Planning
big
Commission.
plan, send it to them for the recommendation. It's not.
So we could throw an idea to them and then they could report.
Yeah.
and
They're
recommend.
they're
But
basically
they're
the
the
workhorse for us.
right. They do the legwork.
If you want to use them.
Yeah.
If you want to use them just as somebody to bounce ideas off of, you can. That's not the way it's been done.
That's not the healthiest way to do it. Just saying.
Steve, I'll ask you the next one. Can a level of service ordinance limit development? So, for example, a city requires 356 gallons per minute to be available at homes or hydrants. The new development would drop the pressure to 20 gallons per minute. Are there levels of service ordinance limits?
Definitely yes. And you can see in that example, I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but again, if you've established with your fire department a certain level of hydrant flow and new developments is going to result in that flow decreasing to a point where it's deemed to be not safe or not able to function properly in the case of a fire emergency, you wouldn't want to allow that development to occur. Instead, what the GMA is trying to do in terms of comprehensive planning, your local ordinances, capital, is to make sure that as you're anticipating new growth happening in various parts of your community, that you have the facilities and services available to accommodate that new growth. So that's just one of several examples. And that's why when looking at the capital facilities element and establishing levels of service, you want to pay close attention to that, because it seems like it could be a very technical, very trite exercise. In reality, it's something that has a lot of impacts. This is one example. Transportation is another one, where you want to make sure you have the right amount of transportation facilities that are able to service the new growth. You want to make sure you have enough, probably not too much, because that's going to be very expensive and maybe over capacity, and not too little, because it's going to maybe create some issues in your community. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, Leonard, I have another one for you. So regarding the Growth Management Act, what if the city council decides to place a growth moratorium? Is there actions against the state? I'm sorry. Are there actions the state can or would take against them?
It's a good question, and the first part of this would be definitely talk to your legal counsel very closely around this issue. There are provisions for moratoriums under certain circumstances that are allowed within state law. So not a general moratorium on any growth or any development, but if there's specific findings you can make due to a certain issue, typically it'll be where you find, for example, that allowing growth would further exacerbate a condition that's fairly recently come up in your community. For example, when marijuana businesses were allowed, many communities established a moratorium for a period of time so they could study that and determine where in the community it was appropriate to allow those kinds of businesses. That's an appropriate use of a moratorium, and it's typically got a time limit on it. The ordinance you adopt must have the findings that you make about the emergency situation, how long it will take you to address it, and there are a few provisions that can occasionally allow for extensions of that timeline under certain circumstances. But I would say be very careful around this issue and talk closely with your legal counsel so you don't run afoul of those restrictions in the state law around how to do this.
Great, thank you. And I also had a comment that someone had 2 questions, but they already were answered through Chris, so good job.
Great.
I have one final question for you, Steve, and then we'll wrap it up and get everyone on their way. But is waiving or returning impact fees or other development fees to the developer considered a gift of public funds?
Right. So I'm not an attorney, but from a land use perspective, my knowledge of the Growth Management Act and impact fees, and at MRSC, I get asked a lot of questions about use and collection of impact fees. I think if done correctly, it would not be a gift of public funds. There are certain provisions, very limited provisions in state law that allow waiving or in some cases a reduction in terms of how much you would assess a particular type of development from certain impact fees. Again, affordable housing, homeless shelters, things of that nature. State law allows you to reduce, or in some cases, not even impose an impact fee on those specific uses. And so if you were wanting to do that, you want to make sure, again, talking with your legal counsel and looking at state law to make sure that you want to do that ahead of time. You wouldn't want to do that ad hoc, fly by night, case by case basis. On returning impact fees, again, state law, I wouldn't recommend that you do that willy-nilly. In fact, you shouldn't do that. But state law, Growth Management Act actually says that if you've collected impact fees for a legitimate purpose and 6-10 years down the road, you haven't expended the impact fees for that facility for which they were intended to be collected and used, then you're actually obligated to return the impact fees back to the developer, the property owner, or the applicant that provided them in the first place. So that's a case where you're actually compelled to return it unless for some reason you can get an agreement to allow for an extension beyond the 10-year period by the person who originally paid the impact fees.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to answer some of the questions from our attendees today. So just in closing, I want to let you know that we will be sending you an evaluation, and recorded link will be sent within the next week. We do encourage you to watch the recorded webinar with your counsel and refer back to it as much as needed through December 2018. I know a lot of jurisdictions did watch this together today, and we appreciate that. So if you did watch as a group, please fill out the form that was emailed to you to receive one certificate for municipal leadership credit towards community planning and development for those elected officials that joined us today. We hope you join us live for the final webinar of the series on October 11 for effective local leadership, how to move initiatives forward and get things done. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you that took the time out of your day to join us for this webinar, and also to our fabulous presenters today, Leonard Bauer and Steve Butler. I'll remind you that their email and their contact information is listed on slide 6 of this handout, and they have both agreed that if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to them. And thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Very good.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I think, so at the next council meeting, I'll kind of provide what I currently have as a draft layout of all these other trainings and everything. And so it's kind of trying to tee up and time it to where this discussion comes in conjunction with other policies that we're discussing, or legislation or processes as well. So you know, the annexation that we went through last year is on the Planning Commission's plate for the first part of this year. And so that's part of the reason for the timing of this. To understand what our roles and responsibilities are with regards to this.
Well, Leon, I appreciate you putting this stuff together for us, so thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm also submitting all of your names to the Association of Washington Cities, so you get certified municipal leader credit. So if you do attend any of the others,
Yeah, I believe there is excellence in
Not just leaders, excellent.
we're excellent leaders, and I feel like we should get a certificate or something that says that
Well,
somewhere.
I'll bring the silver, I'll bring the gold stars for you.
well, I think if you attend a certain number, get a certain number of credits, you do get some sort of award or certification. So there you go. But if you do attend, there's a lot of these on the AWC website. And so if you do attend any on your own, you can submit them through, it's typically at the bottom of the page for each training as well. So.
Don't get
I
sunburned,
watched it, I
Christie.
didn't submit. Oh, hi, Christy. I see how
You're
it
on
is.
mute.
We can't hear you though.
Okay,
There you go.
so I'm not gonna get sunburned because, you know, melanoma, but it is beautiful. Look at this.
Yeah, we're looking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's
Very nice.
awesome.
well,
Look
have a
at my-
great time,
my-
Christy.
look at
That's
the little
awesome.
How come we weren't invited?
Oh, I must have.
Is that where we should have our next council retreat?
Lost in the
Yeah.
There
mail.
you go.
Lost in the mail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
All right.
Okay,
Is that it?
Anytime you want to talk about like getting the weeds of anything here, I sit right over there.
I do actually have a question that I want to talk about eventually, which was what happened in White Salmon. And did you guys hear about what happened in White Salmon? They shot down. There was the hotel there. I don't remember what the hotel's called, but hotel something or other. Has a lot, and they were going to build multifamily housing for employees on that lot.
Hmm.
And the city council said no, because it was over the density of the zone that it was in. And they were like, this is how we keep employees here. This is how we're going to be able to do this. And they were just like, no, well, that's just doesn't fit with what's there. We're not going to make an exception. And they said no. And some folks
So
were not super pumped about that, but at the same time, I wasn't there, so I don't know the ins and outs of what really happened. That's what was reported.
and that was actually in Bingen, and it was the High
Oh, Bingen,
Society
sorry.
Hotel. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And so,
But it's
I mean,
Bingen, White
it's,
Salmon, you know.
yeah, well, I think a similar issue could come here if a person wanted to build something multifamily in an R1 zone. I mean, we do have a process to go through for that. I
Right.
don't know what Bingen's process is. But I think one of the concerns that they had also though was infrastructure.
Oh, yeah.
So again, that would be an issue that we would have. If we didn't have the sewer capacity, the water capacity, or the street infrastructure to allow a development of that size.
Like parking and everything else.
Yeah. So I mean, it's complex when you talk about that.
Well, it's still something that we talk about enough about the different, the zoning and the density and what we're trying to do, what our goal is, and finding housing for people that want to work in town. We have a lot of those issues, the same issues they have, we have here, and they took a step that I just, like I said, I don't have all the information. So that's one of those, I can't say, well, they were wrong. They could have been totally right. And we could have made the same call had it happened here. I don't know. It just on paper up front was like, what? Why?
Well, don't you believe all the news you read?
Yeah, all the time,
Okay.
all the time.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was just one of those that was interesting. And I like to, kind of explore that idea, because we have places, the lodge, if they decided to try something like that, present something like that, what would our response even be? Because it wasn't huge. It wasn't like you were asking for like 50 units. It was like 4 or something like that. It was not something that would take a whole city block. It was in a lot but it was multifamily, and it was not within what they had zoned for. So
I can
And they were
reach out
just-
to them and see, get more details on that.
Yeah, I'm just curious to see what, because the comments that were printed for what their city council members made, the actual comments. I would have had a hard time voting alongside with that. So there's got to be more information that I just don't have. So I'd be curious to find that out.
It seems like there'd have to be an infrastructure component to it or
There's got to be
something.
more than what was printed, because it just, even like I said, just the responses that council members made was just like, well, it doesn't fit our thing. Well, okay.
People need places to live.
Well, what are we talking about here? Like, how's the cost benefit not a positive, a net gain on that in the long run? But maybe I'm wrong. Like I said, there's probably more information I just don't know about. And so I would be very curious to find out that, just to try and head it off before something like that happens in Stevenson.
Well, I think before, with the limited amount of buildable space, use
Mhm.
vernacular,
Yeah.
that we have available left within the city limits. I think we're gonna see units that go up rather than out.
Well, and that's what this was. It
Yeah.
was, yeah,
I mean,
it makes sense.
that's
Yeah.
the only way it's gonna have to be able to work. But
Anyway, sorry, I that was just something that kind of in relation to what we're talking about that I would be curious to find out about.
Well, and I think too, there are some hard decisions that council will have to make based on what the priorities are. So if housing is a priority, there was recently an area that was zoned R3. And rather than, them sort of having multifamily units put in, it was short platted and so subdivided, and it's gonna be, 3 single family residences instead of,
Right.
12 units. But the only way to make that happen
It
is
was
to
something
have minimum
20.
densities.
Yeah, it could have been a
20
totally
units
different,
Could have been there.
right? And it's gonna be
They
3.
had the option, they divided it into 4 lots.
Four, right.
Sold those 4 lots.
Because they
to
can make that much more
a
money.
group of 3 people. And who just want the other one as open space, so, yeah, they were responding to the market.
Sure.
And
Right.
we're allowed to do within our. So all
Right.
of that territory that we have is no longer.
Right, all the
available.
structure
not
we're
on the
trying to
inventory,
get
yeah.
is now, that's out.
Yep.
So. Yeah, these are just questions, I mean, I know this is a big questions, long-term questions, not just to like off the cuff, but it was just one of those, when I read that, I was like, I've got to find out more about this, because that just does not make any sense to me whatsoever.
Well, I get it. If you're gonna invest in property,
Oh, no, that one, I
I get
understand
that.
from
I
the owner's
understand.
side.
yeah, but then how do we address this other side?
From the city
That's
side.
tough.
Yeah, there are
And that's-
people- well,
I was gonna say, you kind of have a blend, there's a difference between, yes, people have property rights, but also forwarding the visions and needs of your community kind of can be challenging sometimes.
I know that from quasi personal experience
Yeah.
here. Yes,
Okay,
all right, that's all I had.
anything else? Liana, you
No.
have anything else?
Nope.
Christie?
Nope. Back to the pool.
Okay,
We don't-
well, enjoy your vacation, Christie. We miss you.
We don't have any subdivision specific regulations coming up or proposals that I know of, but I do have some Stevenson. Some trainings I've prepared for subdivisions that.
Oh, good.
That'd be great.
Periodically, so we can talk about that. It's not the nuts and bolts of our code, it's just why are we regulating subdivisions and how we go about it. So I can do that at future ones. When the time's right.
Okay,
Cool,
cool.
All right.
Thank you.
all right.
Okay, nothing further. We will
Good job.
finish this thing, adjourn it at 7:14.